Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Green Women's Declaration webinar. You're very welcome. Thank you all for joining us. So I'm just going to go through a very quick disclaimer now before we start. This is a webinar where we'll be inviting lots of different views and different opinions. I'm sure that should come as no surprise and no shock to anybody now. So we're not saying this just to warn you that you might hear ideas that you don't agree with. We actually hope that you hear ideas that you do not agree with. That's part of our purpose. That's part of the purpose of the Declaration webinars. We at the Green Women's Declaration believe that we can only solve our wider systemic issues that humanity is facing today when we learn how to listen and to incorporate all perspectives. So while some of the ideas that you hear tonight may make some people uncomfortable and will almost certainly contradict Green Party policy, we hope that they will provide you with useful material for you to formulate and develop your own ideas on some very interesting and important topics around safeguarding, around freedom of speech, and around women's issues and the way that we can attempt to do politics differently. We may not agree 100%, in fact, we almost certainly will not. But it is about allowing these discussions to unfold. At Green Women's Declaration, we believe that historically that has been a central feature of the Green Party philosophical basis. And the very fact that we are having to make this disclaimer and remind people of the importance of allowing all views to be heard really kind of underscores the point. We want to create a holistic and ecological approach to problem solving, and that speaks to the very nature of the issue at hand. The Green Party is having an identity crisis. It is no longer able to uphold its own philosophical basis. And tonight, our webinar will be exploring that question. Is the Green Party having an identity crisis and why? And we'll be asking that question of our own very special guests, Darren Johnson and Simon Edge. Darren and Simon are very well known and important figures historically within the Green Party's recent past, and they've got some real experience of on the ground interactions with our leadership team and many different experiences, which we're really looking forward to hearing from them about. But before we do hear from Simon and Darren, because there's been quite a few developments, and I'm going to switch over to Jude now in order to get her to give us an update on her situation.
Thanks, Zoe. Lovely introduction. Great to be here again. Since the last time we were here, what has happened? Well, I have been no fault suspended by GPRC, ably abetted by a member of my own Bristol party, Simon Stafford Townsend, and his wife, Annie Stafford Townsend, both senior members of the party, one on DC and one a party chair and our electoral returning officer. So the complaint basically said that I ran the webinar with Zoe and we spoke to a lawyer about things they didn't like. So attention was got. The disclaimer where we said, don't come into this safe space. It's not a safe space. Don't come in if you don't want, was obviously not noted by Simon. And he's used evidence from inside that to write a very, very unpleasant complaint about me that basically says, because I believe sex is real, I cannot be a member of the Green Party and I cannot be allowed to continue to be part of Carla's campaign or the Bristol Green Group. So that in itself is very disappointing. Obviously a terrible shock, means financial detriment for me because I was not able to stand as a councillor. So the Green Party have probably fallen into the worst possible policy trap that they could in terms of suspending somebody who will suffer financial detriment. None of the other cases are in that position. So just to say that that's going to be something very interesting for our governance bodies to think about in the next few months post-election. And hopefully it will give them some food for thought when they actually understand what the actual law is, what actual discrimination has happened, and what reality is like when it happens in the real world, rather than just behind closed scenes or when you're just, getting rid of a few volunteers you don't like. So that's what's happened there. Zoe, you've got news too, I think.
I have. Very exciting news. I've actually been expelled from the party since the last time we spoke. So since the last time we did a webinar. And I just want to give you a quick overview of what the situation was for me. I was the Green Party Women co-chair when I was suspended. I was suspended after reporting the Green Party to the EHRC for discrimination, examples of discrimination which were widespread. Of course, I was also a witness in the Shara Ali case where the party was found guilty of discrimination on the basis of Shara being discriminated against on the basis of his gender critical beliefs. And I have now been expelled. There were 9 vexatious complaints put in against me across the course of last year. So it really was a whole year of being subjected to victimization and harassment. And some of the complaints that were made against me, they should all have been dismissed outright. They were completely unsubstantiated. Some of them were referred to an external investigator. The external investigator was looking into them, but it never got to the point of any hearing or any possible right of reply on my part. GPRC had a secret meeting apparently in November in order to decide to expel me. Their votes apparently were 6 votes to 7, so it's just a majority of 1 that decided to expel me. And then there's been absolutely no hearing. There's been no investigation of the complaints against me. There's just been a decision taken by GPRC to essentially politically assassinate me, to remove me from office. This obviously was to the detriment of the Green Party Women's Special Interest Group as well, because they had a co-chair removed, and then the group was shut down pretty soon after that. They're weakened because I wasn't there as a representative to be able to lobby on their behalf. And this is part of a wider story of political assassinations, which have been stepping up as GPRC have been taking some pretty outrageous actions against other members of the party. And Jude, I think you're going to give us an overview of some of the others that have been going on.
Yes. So it's an interesting step forward, isn't it? Whereas previously, I think people have been saying, oh, well, it's because they don't agree with our policy, they're being dismissed and suspended. But what we're seeing now is a pattern. I was removed, I think, because I was chair of Green Party Women, because I've been outspoken, not in my local party at all, actually. I think that's a side issue to deliberately punish me in Bristol. But I was personally due to be Alison Teal's Mackenzie friend at her hearing. So people will remember that Alison Teal is also on a unfair no-fault suspension for over 19 months, which has prevented her from being the prospective parliamentary candidate for Sheffield and has completely sabotaged the Sheffield campaign. So she's been in that terrible position. I was about to be a witness, and I've sent in 3 separate speaking outs explaining why it's such a outrageous thing to have happened to her, and being extremely critical of DC and GPRC. So I think there's a bit of leakage there where getting rid of me, my political assassination has, multiple goals for them. But we've also seen people like Robbie Spence be suspended, expelled because he's on DC disciplinary committee. We've seen Imogen Makepeace recently, also on DC committee, being suspended terribly before she was about to become the mayor of Lewes Council. We've seen 3 members of our elders group, the seniors group, Frida, Nicola and Eric, suspended for allowing free speech inside their group. We've seen Lucy, one of our disabled members, suspended for daring to say something inside green spaces. And what we can see with these people and others is a deliberate witch hunt or heresy hunt, to use the words in a recent court case that's happened, where people are being tracked. And for example, like me, words taken out of context inside some actual policy making or policy discussion group like this, and then used deliberately by this team of DC and GPRC and local party members working together to politically assassinate people, to stop any of us standing for GPRC, to stop any of us standing for GPEX, to stop any of us standing to be PPCs or even councillors. So it's an absolutely outrageous situation inside the party. I mean, when I say it like this, I don't know whether people can properly understand how many rules of our own we are breaking, and also how many actual laws these people are breaking every time they do it. If I've missed anyone off the long list, I'm sorry, but there's about 17 or 18 people, I think, at the moment that we know of, and 70% of them are women. Yeah. So that's the other thing we must make really clear. It's much, much, much easier, I think, for men to say even a little bit of something in the party than it is for women. We get hammered straight away. I mean, that's one of the reasons it's lovely to have Simon and Darren here. You're still standing, Darren, so that's great.
Shall we do? I don't want to forget, of course, Sarah removed from SOC.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Sarah Bingham removed from her position of SOC, Standing Orders Committee. So yes, she's a very important person who's been holding the fort there on the legal side of stuff and trying to make them see sense when they can't see sense. So yes, people being taken out of all major committees. We've had John Matthews taken out of GPRC, and we also know that people who haven't been suspended but who've just left these very important committees because they've been bullied so hard and for so long that they literally cannot stand any more of it. I mean, John talked about it being a kind of constructive dismissal, and I think that's what's happening as well. People just cannot bear to be in these committees anymore because they're not allowed to speak and they're treated abysmally.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's remember that you've mentioned the party's rules, and of course it talks about suspension and expulsion should only be used in should be avoided wherever possible. A diversity of opinions is likely to exist within any organisation. This is our own rules, and political difference should not automatically be the basis for expulsion of any party member. Well, it's lovely words, but we'd like to actually see it being followed through with actions, wouldn't we? Okay. That's your news update. I know it's a lot for everybody to take it on board. There is more information on the Green Women's Declaration website as well if people want to follow that up afterwards. And of course, they can always write to us for more information. But I really want us to move on now, and let's hear from both of our very special guests this evening. And first of all, I'm going to introduce Darren Johnson. You joined the Green Party in 1987, age 20, a little while ago now. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your journey into the party. What made you join? How long have you been a member? Are you still a member? And what is it that caused you to join the party in the first place?
Well, I joined, it was not long after the Chernobyl disaster, and that really got me thinking about the environment for the first time. It's when they started giving out radiation warnings as part of the weather forecast. I thought we're doing something seriously wrong with our environment. So that sort of got me thinking about the environment back then. And I just tended to think about that as a single issue alongside lots of other single issues I was interested in, like animal welfare, like generally being left of centre on social issues, whether it was housing or the economy or whatever. Gay rights I was particularly interested in. It was the time of Section 28 and so on. So there was all these things, and then I just tended to think of them as a sort of ragbag of completely separate issues that didn't have much to do with each other. And then I came across the Green Party's manifesto, and it sort of brought them all together into some sort of coherent philosophy. So I thought, well, wow, this is, I certainly didn't join expecting to get a full-time career in politics out of it, which I ended up doing for 16 years. But I don't think anyone joined in 1987 expecting to get a career as an elected politician out of it. And I mean, I think on this whole identity crisis issue that we're talking about tonight, I think there has been a bit of a misreading in some quarters in sort of GC circles. When I see some of the discussion, it's why don't the Green Party get back to talking about the environment rather than going on about gender all the time and being obsessed with trans issues. Now, that's a fair point, but it's a fundamental misreading of green politics to just think that it's a single issue party. It was never a single issue party. Firstly, because all of these issues, if you do want ecological sustainability, then you have got to look at social policy, transport policy, economic policy, and so on. You can't just narrowly look at the environment. And secondly, if you are getting Greens elected, then they need to have something coherent to be able to say and act upon on all the issues, not just on the environment. So I don't think it's that the Green Party has strayed into social issues when it never had before. That's a complete misreading. The Green Party's always had that broad base of policy. The only problem now is it strayed in the social issues which in some cases is utterly barking mad, defies reality, defies logic, defies child safeguarding, defies so many things. But the problem is not that we've strayed into social policies. We've always strayed into social policies. It's always been part of the DNA of green politics. But the problem now is we've strayed into crazy social policies, and that's got to change.
Thank you, Darren. Brilliant. Before we go on to Simon, please could you just give us a very brief for people here who might not have a full understanding of what you're referencing when you talk about a full-time career in politics? Can you just give us a little bit more of a wider perspective on that? What did you do? You had some great roles within the party. So
I started off campaigning in the 80s, standing for local elections. I didn't have any background in campaigning, but I found out early on that I seemed to have a knack for sort of helping get people organised, and Greens weren't always the most organised people. I found that I just had a natural knack for sort of getting the nuts and bolts organised, getting things to the printers on time, and getting maps out and all those sort of things. So I sort of started to get good at elections and running elections. Then moved to London, and eventually when the Blair government announced the new London-wide authority elected under proportional representation, I just finished university as a choice. I thought, this is a brilliant thing. I could do this. I know a lot about this, and I really want to do this. So I was elected to the London Assembly in 2000, served for 16 years, and I stepped down not because it wasn't a sort of it wasn't a flounce with the Green Party. I'd just come to the realization after living and breathing green politics for my entire adult life. I was coming up to the age of 50, and I thought there's actually a few other things I want to do in life, and a few other interests that I've got apart from politics. I want to be able to spend some time doing those. So that's why I eventually stepped down. I saw signs that things were, starting to go. I saw certain trends.
Well, I think we'll come on to that. What happened and how did it go wrong in a minute, if that's okay, Darren. But so thank you. So basically, you were party's national elections coordinator, and you served as a principal speaker. You've got really high credibility here on your experience from within the party. And I understand you were a founder member of the party's LGB group back in the 1980s as well. So we'd love to hear about that in a little while.
Conference we had, we had our first inaugural meeting there, and set up a new group in the party, which has now morphed into this sort of group.
We'll have a little chat about the group
that's getting you all expelled. You blame me for it. I'll set it up.
Let's have a little chat now with Simon. Simon, really welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. You had when was it you joined the party? Do you want to tell us a little bit about?
I'm a fly by night compared with Darren. Darren's proper eminence grise. Weren't you actually, Darren? Weren't you deputy mayor of London at one stage?
No, that was my colleague Jenny Jones, but I did serve chair of the assembly a couple of times.
Okay, yeah. I thought you were hiding a light under a bushel, but for me, I'm much more of a political butterfly. I think I'm basically not very good at being in political parties because I get cross and leave, and I haven't got the staying power. But I joined in the Green Surge in I think 2013, when I had been horrified by Blair, the Blair years, by the war in Iraq. I've got quite a lot of background in the Middle East. That was a big deal for me, and I was just viscerally appalled by that. And I hadn't seen very much of the Green Party. I had met Darren during that first campaign back in 2000 for the London Assembly, but I didn't know very much about the Green Party. Then the Greens, every now and then there's a bit of a green surge, isn't there? The Green Party gets on more people's radar. So I joined then, and I was a journalist. I'd been at the Daily Express for quite a long time as a bit of a fish out of water there. and I was hoping to do. So I thought it would be nice to work in politics instead of in journalism, and I took redundancy, and I spent most of my first year of redundancy in working volunteering with Greenwich Greens, which was a utterly lovely experience. And as a former national newspaper journalist, I had a lot of skills. So we had the best functioning communications department of any local Green Party, and then for the mayoral election of 2016, I went and worked as part of the team. So I was doing the press for Siân's campaign, which was the time that Siân and Caroline Russell were first elected to the Assembly, and I left the party not long after that campaign came to an end. I didn't have a particularly good time during it for various reasons which aren't that interesting to anybody else. But I have continued, I guess, to be, I've become quite a kind of ubiquitous commentator on this issue on Twitter, and I do tend to put my oar in about the Green Party, largely because I know the people involved, and I know the characters, I know the significance of who the main players are. And I can, that time, 2015, 2016, when I was sort of at the top table, or the London top table anyway, was clearly a very formative time in terms of the gender insanity. And a number of the people who have become, major drivers of this insanity had not yet decided where they stood on this. So I quite like being, I don't consider myself a supporter of the Green Party. I do consider myself a supporter of people like you who are standing and fighting, and I've got the utmost respect for you, for all of you, for having the guts to stay and fight rather than just walk away as I did. But I'm almost with journalist hat on. I'm just fascinated by the way that the Green Party, as clearly as a almost negligible parliamentary force, which is not seen as a significant player in the media, but as a niche bit of the left, can act as a vanguard, and it has done all kinds of things. It has done in, Darren can talk about, his work in the Assembly, where the Greens were pioneering a lot of things that then become very familiar initiatives. And I think on gender it has been very similar. And so the warm welcome which the Green Party gave to gender ideology, I think, and the Green Party was the first to have the alphabet initialism for the gay, lesbian and gay group, for example, then, which looked insane when only the Greens were doing it, and then the other parties copied it. So for me, my personal history in it, and having seen it so close up, to me, that the capture of the Green Party has been like a kind of case study in how the whole country was captured.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So kind of looking then at the history of the Green Party, I think we probably all agree that we are in green politics because we don't think of it as a single issue, but it is a single philosophy, I think. It's about looking at things from an ecological perspective. It's about looking at things from a perspective of interconnectedness. And I'm sure, Jude, you've got a lot more to say about this and about how actually it's always been a party of science first. Do you want to say anything more about that, Jude?
Yes, I think it's quite interesting because obviously people will understand that I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I'm currently writing to GPEX to explain why a court case that's led by me will be particularly harmful to the party, because I was talking to a journalist yesterday. I said, how would you describe yourself? Now, I would describe myself as an ecological green, and deep ecology is based on science and it's based on sexual dimorphism. So we can't have an ecological niche or ecological generation without an understanding of science and of evolution. In the thing I was sacked for, the lesbian perspective, I wrote something about, I think this speaks to what Simon's saying, about the Green Party's always had a corner in it of the kind of cranks and you know, the really edge of where we are, you know, the David Icke type lizard loving things and thinking homeopathy is a great thing. And I said that the young people don't even seem to believe in evolution. So, you know, there is this niche corner where we've been captured by, again, these rather insane thoughts. And if it comes out in court, we discuss our fundamental philosophical being and what we really believe, we will have to talk about ecological materiality. We'll have to talk about biological materiality. I've also given a couple of speeches at Philia and places like that where I've tried to talk to the audience about, you know, only the Green Party and the Communist Party have a basis in materiality. Other parties are to do with economic theory or liberal theory or conservatism, but we have a basis in fundamental reality. So as Shah has also said, it's a very ungreen thing indeed to believe in this gender insanity, Simon, and to then promulgate it through our kind of DNA and out into the wider world as an offering to the wider society. It doesn't fit in well with our views on big pharma, big oil, or any kind of capitalism, you know, and growth. So it's a mad thing that we've brought into the house. And when I stand up in a court and say this, and somebody like Carla has to say, well, that's not what I think of the Green Party's for, it'll be, well, come on, explain what kind of green you are. So I think they're on some dodgy ground there, but I'll leave it for now.
Thank you, Jude. So then, gentlemen, where did it go wrong and why? I guess. And then two next questions. Where did it go wrong? If we had this fundamental basis, yes, we had a lot of free thinkers in the party that were coming in with some ideas. When you've got a party that has and allows free thought, you're going to have some people coming in with very strange, weird and random thoughts. But that's, of course, where you get the original ideas as well. That is what has made us change makers in the past, because we've had original thought, innovative ideas, and then we've introduced policies which other parties have then jumped on the back of and thought, that's a great idea, we'll have that because it's a vote winner as well. Fantastic. And that's how we managed to affect change, even though we were very small. Now what we're seeing is that, you know, there's a complete shift, and I'm interested in your perspective on where that shift has happened and why. Who would like to answer that first? Please, yeah.
I mean, in terms of the Green Party actually coming up with ideas, I mean, it has, as Simon was saying, been a catalyst for a lot of things that then become more mainstream. But the ideas rarely are cooked up in the Green Party in isolation. They often come from social movements, press groups, from wider civil society, and from student politics. And I mean, across Europe, a lot of the leading people who were founding members of Green parties in Germany and France and so on, were leading lights in the 1968 student protests across Europe. So there's always been that sort of relationship between student politics and student radicalism and green politics. There has been that relationship, which has generally been very fruitful and generally worked very well. But if student politics starts going a bit crazy, and a lot of this, I think a lot of the gender identity, and it wasn't just on the identity politics, wasn't just about gender, although that's obviously been, one of the key things. But a lot of the stuff that we now see about, dreadlocks being racist and sushi being racist and that sort of, very extreme interpretation of cultural appropriation. It all comes from these very trendy American universities, gets imported into student politics in Britain, then gets adopted by the Young Greens, and then gets adopted by the main Green Party, and that's basically what's happened. And it's basically where we are. I mean, I started to see some of this in my last term as a London Assembly member, 2012 to 2016, and towards that. That was when Simon came in, so he can talk about this as well. But I started to notice it, and I think the first big pylon that I remember on gender was Rupert Read, who's a very eloquent, very thoughtful philosopher who'd written a piece about gender identity from a gender critical perspective as a philosopher, and got this massive pile on. This was in early 2015, ahead of the 2015 general election. And to my shame, I spoke out against the pylon and the way that the sort of aggressive way that Rupert had been treated by this sort of, I mean, it was the early years of social media, and it was the sort of, early days in all of that. But I was, I was appalled for Rupert. I did speak on that. I do regret that I didn't speak out more on the actual gender issue per se at that time, because I'd done a calculation. I thought, well, this is my last year in office. I can either speak out on this and get completely sidetracked and do nothing else apart from getting totally sidetracked on the gender debate, which was, really starting to take hold then, or I can do some stuff around affordable housing and air pollution and some of my key priorities as an Assembly member. And I took the coward's way out, and I sort of thought, well, I'm going to concentrate on my bread and butter remit as an Assembly member, and not say, I mean, I did say a little bit, but it wasn't until I actually stepped down that I really spoke my mind on the whole gender issue. Anyone who'd had a conversation with me at any point in the Green Party for my entire membership would have been clear that I did not believe mammals can change sex. I never believed that brains could be born in the wrong body. And I always found the sort of male transsexuals having a very having a very sort of male interpretation of womanhood. And I spoke to those.
I think it's very generous of you there, Darren, to say that your words were the coward's way out, and I wonder if that's representative of what so many people chose to do early on in this journey. And you're talking about the vilification of people that started to speak out. Actually, and they weren't even particularly, I don't think Rupert spoke out in a way that was particularly bold. He just took started to explore that.
I mean, it was an academic article that had a few lines. It's about gender identity.
But I'd love to go to Simon as well and say, do you think that it is cowardice that stopped people from speaking out, or do you think it was ignorance, or a bit of both, or do you think that it was that people thought that it would just go away, it wouldn't actually take hold in the way that it has? Give all your thoughts, Simon.
I dimly remember that, and I think I must have been a member then, but I wasn't all over Twitter at the time, so it didn't properly cross my radar. But I do remember the odd, I remember Rupert's name coming up, and I generally remember, the sense of the grown-ups, the people who were either professional politicians or who wanted to be and had a decent chance of becoming one, basically saying you don't want to, put your foot in it like Rupert did, and it was on that level. It wasn't Rupert's an evil toxic bigot, evil hateful bigot. It was, sort of fucking hell, Rupert just miscalculated there, and nobody wants to go down that road, because who would? And I remember, I think none of us could conceivably see how much of this, the express train coming at us, and I had a conversation with, my background was very much in gay activism and lesbian and gay activism and journalism. Excuse me. And I found it just cringe, embarrassing that the Greens group was at that time called the LGBTQIA plus group. And I was in charge of writing press releases, and Siân needed some policies to put to put in that little bit of her manifesto, and we were trying to think up some policies. And there were things at the time. There were rent rises in Soho, so the scene was getting driven away. And I just said, having no idea that this was a minefield, because it wasn't really then. I just said, calling, by the way, using this initialism, LGBTQIA plus is electorally insane, because actual gay voters will think you're mad. And it's interesting to look back on that, because Siân listened and was happy to drop it and deferred to me. The group itself said, you can't drop that because that's our name, and there was of course some truth in it. And of course I was proved ridiculously, madly wrong, in that my notion was that other people like me, of mine and Darren's generation, and then anybody younger than us, would find it insulting to have our identity, community, whatever, hijacked by these absurd initials. The asexual thing was the most, I remember saying to Siân, you can't have a press release about venues in Soho, because what the hell is an asexual bar? What I didn't foresee was the embrace of this new identity movement by call it what you like, the Rainbow Borg, by charities, by media, by basically self-interested people who could see their constituency greatly expanding and their job tenure greatly lengthening, who then found themselves in positions of great influence as influencers, decision makers, informers for the community. And LGBTQ plus, at any rate, became completely normalized. But at that time, I didn't have any sense that you can't say this. I was in a room where I was expressing views which I hadn't realized were especially controversial. I remember having conversations in the office about how, the most trans-friendly regimes in the world are Iran and Pakistan, because it's such a fundamentally homophobic idea, and people going, really? Oh, I didn't know about that. And it was almost like it was it was like a normal political issue where people either agree or they don't, but they don't throw you out, and they don't ban you for even daring to say it. Because who could have predicted that it would turn into just the witch hunt issue of the century?
Yeah, well, thank you. I'd really like to bring.
Sorry, can I just chip in quickly, because I think Simon put that very eloquently about where the LGBT, all the other sort of movement has gone. I think it's fair to say Simon has about as much chance of being a leading gay journalist as I would have of being a leading Green politician, which is precisely zero for both of us, given the way that both of those movements have gone.
Yeah, really. Oh, thank you. And I wanted to expand really on this, the homophobia within that movement, and bring in Jude as well to talk about her particular perspective as a lesbian within the party. Do you want to say anything more about that, Jude, or at this stage?
Well, I will say something, because I was elected as a councillor in 2016 to a small group of 11, I would say, very intelligent and thoughtful councillors of the old school. And even then, 2016, as a lesbian, the alarm was being raised by my friends. And I was certainly not as peaked as some of them, but they were coming to me and saying, this is happening. And I didn't really understand. But then at one point, I remember bringing it up in a Green Group meeting in the council and saying, this is going to be important, but then not really understanding quite how much of a train crash it was going to be. And of course, at that point, in some ways, that's also when it became very apparent to me that if you didn't kind of toe the line, you would have a target on your back. It's very, very difficult to talk about it. It was already happening. I mean, so it had spread out into the provinces, if you know what I mean. And I think it's also important to recognise then that that's the time when the Green Party, was starting to pay Stonewall, had Stonewall champion in our midst, Amy Challoner, who then inserted the TWA motion that most people probably didn't notice in 2015. And I'm just looking back at that now going, if you rewrite that and say, in 2015, we put a motion into our own policy lexicon that said sex is not real. If we just write it like that instead and go, at that point, that's when it was just put there. And now, how many years later, for whatever we talk 8 years later, when I say as a lesbian in my own party in Bristol, well, not even directly, by virtue of a webinar, sex is real, I get suspended. So that journey has been very hard, and it's been extremely tough to be in my party in Bristol in the last 4 or 5 years. It's been absolutely horrendous. The homophobia is extreme. The LGBTQI group have immense power, even though most of them, I would say, are not lesbian, gay or bisexual at all. They are some variant of a spicy straight or a queer identified person that believes that they are somehow special and different. But we're not allowed to say it. People are terrified. I mean, absolutely terrified inside the Green Party of even daring to say, why is Jude being suspended? So the culture is extremely homophobic, but the party doesn't even seem to understand that. Can
I come in and I wondered when the name the dreaded Amy Challoner would come up, and since it has, I mean, I just journalistically, I take my hat off really to Amy Challoner. I worry sometimes that the Amy Challoner thing gets overinflated, but as somebody who entered the Green Party at the age of 16 and was a national spokesperson at the age of 17 and was standing for deputy leader at the age of 19 and was profiled in The Guardian at that age of 19 when no other candidate was profiled by The Guardian for deputy leader. What an incredibly effective teenager, and particularly an effective teenager who I never saw Amy Challoner speak, but I don't believe I don't think there's any track record of Amy Challoner being a good public speaker or being particularly persuasive. But wow, it's quite an achievement that you can. And I think that there was organizing. I don't know if it was bullying at that stage. I can't really say, but I can certainly say that I vividly remember, because I was, as I say, it was fun for me because I was in the room with these grown-ups who, like Darren, who'd been doing this for a long time, and there was an awful lot of eye rolling. Not everybody liked each other in that room, but everybody. Well, the one thing that everybody was united by was how mad the Young Greens were. Apologies to any Young Greens who happen to be here now. There was somebody, for example, who I am not at all on good terms with now, who would say, the Young Greens are the biggest load of nutters, and the way you navigate your way through this is by trying not to upset them. And the Young Greens in particular were in complete and utter thrall to Amy Challoner because they were of a generation where, wow, trans is just amazing. Trans rules the world. And so that combination of Darren, you had something you pinned on the wall, didn't you? That there was, what was it you basically the way to prosper in the Green Party is to find the ways around stuff so that you can make differences and changes when nobody else notices.
Well, I mean, that was always the way. I mean, I the Green Party was always a bit dysfunctional and a bit anarchic, and I early on I realised that you could actually use that to your advantage. And if you wanted to be really professional and set up a local party that was really professional and so on, no one could stop you. It's like so you can actually sort of turn it around on itself. Is how that's how I got on.
But the mantra seemed to be from the grown-ups who wanted to achieve stuff is basically, you need to appease these very young people who have got their sort of tantrum issues, and then provided you've appeased them enough, you can then go off and do the proper stuff, like introduce a bicycle scheme in London, or and so I think, partly the psychology, I think, of what made Siân, who I worked for, who I would go around telling everybody that I liked her a lot, and I think this is one of the smartest people I've ever met. How did that person become the figurehead for this insanity? And I think part of it is, we want to get on with the stuff that we want to do. I want to get back to my spreadsheets and work out how you could abolish the tube zones in London and make everything run better. The stuff that Siân really likes and she's really impressive and really good at. So let's leave the nonsense, the non-binary doodah stuff that none of us understands. Let's leave them in their playpen. Let them get on with that. And that kind of would have worked had not gender ideology had ambitions to take over the world, which was what nobody anticipated.
Well, it's really interesting, Jude. I will come to you in a minute. I just want to set the record straight on a couple of things, but it's been really interesting to hear both of your perspectives. I think, first of all, Jude has already pointed out that when we said nobody was imagining it, of course, women were talking about it more often, a lot earlier than others were, particularly lesbians. They were recognizing that all of their spaces were being invaded and nobody was listening to them. So let's just remember that. Let's also, I think it was really interesting, Simon, that you said, that Challoner was impressive. Other people in the chat have reminded us that actually they think that Challoner was supported or pushed by a Stonewall Trans Advisory Panel and was involved in the background in that. And let's not remember that there was also a court injunction on one of the members who was subsequent of the Green Party. I don't know if they want to be named. They can let me know in the chat if they do. But there was a court injunction by Challoner to silence that person when that person was questioning the trans women are women policy. So there were actually a lot of really effective and pretty insidious levers in the background that were going on in order to make sure that this gender ideology was taking hold. It seems that there was a very effective playbook that was being enacted behind the scenes, and it was felt really coordinated, and I think a lot of other people weren't aware of that. And I think also what you're saying though, Simon, is that it sounds like Siân was kind of hoping it would go away at that stage. And we have definitely, and we'll go to Jude next, but we've definitely seen a shift from that position to someone who is absolutely, a front runner, waving the flag, waving the pink and blue flag, the loudest, if you can wave a flag loudly. So then the other thing, I think somebody else in the chat wanted us to remember that the Young Greens are the only aspect of the party that get money from the party. They're effectively a party within the party. They get £25,000 a year to run their own campaign. So they have a lot of power within the party. With a party that's only got a budget of about 2 million, that's actually quite a lot of expenses for them to further their own aims and their own agenda. And we've seen now the Young Greens as a group, as an organisation, has become a way of climbing the ranks within the party as well, because they can campaign for themselves and use it as a self-promotion tool. Jude, over to you.
I was interested to hear what you say there, Simon, about kind of ignoring them and not disciplining, actually. And I think there's an interesting thing there. So the second thing on my complaint by Simon Stafford Townsend, who was anonymous, but I do know who you are, Simon, was that I had defied the whip. No, not defied the whip, but we had a trans rights motion in Bristol, and I abstained in negotiation with my group. I said, by conscience, I can't do this. And of course, we pretend that we're a party that's not whipped. But the problem with not whipping is that there is no discipline. I see absolutely no discipline inside the party from any of our leaders, apart from this undiscipline of GPRC can do what they like, DC can do what they like. These are the people who were in the playpen all those years ago. Some of them, like one of them, for example, Robin Bramman, who put the complaint in against Alison, is in his early 20s. So we're still allowing this kind of culture of, we'll get on with the important work and we'll let these strange, just let them get on with it. Because what they're getting on with now is they've moved out of the playpen and into the committees. They hold the levers of power. They hold the assassination rifle, and they are absolutely unaccountable. And so as we grow to be a bigger party, let's hope very much that we win these new MPs and we win more councillor seats, because we want to see that positive change in the world to bring in some green policies. But if we don't have any kind of systems to manage this, because we're still not looking at what's happening in the playpen, or maybe I shouldn't call governance the playpen, but it feels like that to me. That's a really, really big issue for a party that wants to take any kind of political control of any kind of local authority or any kind of real power. If we are not doing our job in terms of self-discipline and disciplining our ranks, rather in another way than just saying you're expelled, and just not paying attention. I don't know what you think about that, either of you.
Can I just go back to the Challoner thing about how coordinated the power grab was, because I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I think there is a danger of I'm fascinated by the great paradox of the gender takeover is that as we see, let them speak, the mantra, the hashtag, let them speak. When they do, they're not very good at it. So how is it that people who have got no charisma and have got bonkers ideas and are not very persuasive, nevertheless manage to take over the world in the most extraordinary way? And I think, and we all make our stabs at writing the first drafts of history and explaining all this, but it is, there is a perfect storm, that it's a function of chaos. It's an ideology which seems to like chaos. It's been allowed that by social media. So I think there is I would want to avoid saying, but there was, Stonewall is funded by big billionaires, and Stonewall had Amy Challoner on the Trans Advisory Group, and then sent Challoner into the Green Party to infiltrate. I mean, I know that's not precisely what the person in the chat said, but that's sort of the model. Whereas I think it was just a lot more, hit and miss than that. And that here is somebody who is good with technology and who's doing the block lists and so on, and is good at organizing and was very good at making friends on social media, and just created a power base, which then allows them to be in the Stonewall Trans Advisory Group. And before you know it, you have become a very, very big fish in a little pond. And absolutely point taken that there are people women who've been watching this coming since the mid 2000s, and it was a lot more vivid to lesbians a lot earlier than it was to the likes of me. Absolutely. But just in that room, that it was much more recent. This was not an expulsion issue back in 2016.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon. That's a really nice balance and useful for us to remember. But it does still bring up this question, doesn't it? The LGBTIQA Greens. I'd love us to move on now to thinking about what happened very recently with Cass, because I know that you guys were both really energized by what happened. Angered, upset, disturbed by it. Let's go back to what happened and how the Green Party reacted. Just to remind everybody here that the report, the final Cass report, was issued on the 10th of April. We, as the Green Women's Declaration, actually wrote to the party and to our members on the 14th of April, because we noticed that the Green Party had made no statement about it whatsoever. Lo and behold, 16th of April rolled around, and for about 2.5 hours, the Green Party had a statement up on their website. It was the most sort of neutral, vapid kind of statement, but at least they got something out there, and it did centre on recognising that we need to avoid harm to children. Well done them. But they got it taken down within less than 3 hours, and we understand that was because of pressure from the LGBTIQA Greens. Insiders tell us that that was because that group were threatening the leadership. They were threatening to withdraw their support for the leadership in internal elections. And for anybody here who's not familiar with the party, let's just remember that it's a one member, one vote system. So the LGBTIQA Greens have a powerful lobby, so they will instruct their members to vote for the people that they like best, and the people actually who are supporting their special interest group. So because of that, we understand that this statement was withdrawn. This draws the question, who runs the party and what are the consequences? So let's roll back. I'd love to hear from both of you about what you thought about CAS, why it was so important, which it really was, and then what you think about how this particular political manoeuvre impacted the party and what that has as a consequence. Because if they've got the power to do that, then what other power have they got in the future? Darren, please.
I mean, I've been closely following this debate. I mean, I think the trigger for me really was Julie Bindle's Guardian article in 2004, which was in the context of the Gender Equality Act, and I saw the vitriol that she got. I was completely with Julie Bindle on that. Completely bought her analysis, and I'd actually been, I'd been dipping in and out of various radical feminist debates on this online over the past 20 years. So I had an interest in the debate and had followed this. So it didn't all come as a complete surprise to me out of thin air. I had been following the debate. It was something that I felt strongly about and was interested in. But I decided absolutely that the red line for me and my continued membership of the Green Party would be over CAS. And if anything should bring people to their senses, the idea that vulnerable young people and children are being given these wholly inappropriate, untested, dangerous medical treatments. I mean, it's just so horrific and so wicked that for me, if the Green Party actually came out and just tried to rubbish CAS in the way that the Scottish Green Party did, if that was going to be the official decision and position of the party, then that was going to be the end of my relationship, my 37-year relationship with the Green Party. I was not, that was going to be an absolute red line for me. And then what we saw, I mean, we did see some horrible statements from the Mayor of London candidate for the Greens, and particularly from the Scottish Green MSPs, which are utterly, the way they dismissed CAS was utterly appalling. I was really appalled. But we waited and waited and waited for this official statement. As Zoe said, it came out for something very, very bland. Came out for a couple of hours and then disappeared again. And we're still left with no position at all on this horrific, major medical scandal involving children, and the party's got nothing to say about it. It is appalling. But if the party's official position is going to be to rubbish the CAS report, then that's going to be the end of my relationship with the Green Party. I'm afraid that is the red line for me. Absolutely, Simon.
My point, I think, would be that from an electoral perspective, the Green Party wants votes. When CAS came out, I think it's very difficult for trans activists because the people who had been completely on their side until that point sort of split down the middle. That there were people, Stonewall, suddenly saying, "Yes, Cass is fine. We support Cass," and obviously they don't support Cass. But saying they support Cass is very confusing for people who have been who are reading Billy Bragg on Twitter and looking for reasons to oppose Cass. The Lib Dems got themselves in a similar kind of muddle over putting statements out. But the fact that Wes Streeting in the Labour Party, Wes Streeting, I'm told, by the way, has read Hannah Barnes's book and is a proper convert now. He gets it. This is not just expedient. And Wes Streeting is a great communicator and a rising star within the Labour Party. So that I think does mean that the people with some power, at least in the Labour Party, are serious about supporting Cass. That in ordinary terms, that opens a goalmouth for the Green Party. That there is lots of pale pink and baby blue and pale pink water now opening up, because obviously the Green Party looks for voters who are alienated by the Labour Party. There are a lot of those at the moment. The Green Party would probably do very well at the election, I'd imagine, just because it's safe to vote Green, because it's not going to undermine the landslide. And there's a lot of people who are very disappointed in Starmer. And that would all be fine, apart from the policy as child abuse. And so, normal electoral rules do not apply. So sorry, and absolutely, I mean, the problem now is, actually the issue that the statement that the party put out was as limp and dishonest a statement of support for Cass as you could possibly find. It was that it was like they crawled through the entire report and found something. Today is Wednesday, that they could agree with Cass about, and it was all the most innocuous things that we support Cass on, and then conveniently avoided all the other 1,010 things that they don't support Cass on. Nevertheless, as you say, that was just that it existed for about an hour, didn't it? And then it went, and then you had 2/3 of the Green Party's current representation on the London Assembly, so the deputy leader and the mayoral candidate, both not in any detail at all, but basically doing videos saying we hate Cass, we support trans people who hate Cass, with no substance to it. And Darren will correct me if I'm wrong, but actually your view on Cass is probably neither here nor there. If you remember the London Assembly, biggest fortunate you don't have any powers relating to it. But nevertheless, they are positioning themselves for those bunch of young voters who are very, very motivated by this, very, very misinformed, very, very ignorant. And really, it is a horrible, cynical, vile, nasty thing.
Yeah, it really is. I just want to bring in just a little bit, Jude, you might have something to say about this, about the issue of disrepute, because of course it was the Green mayoral candidate Zoe Garbett who said there's no middle ground between rejecting trans people's humanity and rejecting it, something like that. Anyway, she got completely slated and rubbished by J.K. Rowling, and it's interesting to notice, of course, that Garbett's vote share went down from 7.8% to 5.8% after she did this. That was the result of her vote share. But the quote, the tweet that J.K. said was, if you genuinely think that those of us who believe medical experimentation on children is we do so because we see trans people as subhuman, you've completely lost the plot, is essentially what she said. And you don't even have the ability to run a hot dog stand, let alone a major city. She got 1.6 million views and 5,500 shares, I think, as well. I just want to make the point about disrepute. Jude and I have both been accused of bringing the party into disrepute. Other people have been suspended of being accused of bringing the party into disrepute. What happens to Zoe? Jude, what happened to Zoe? Did she get suspended or sanctioned? No,
she got promoted, didn't she?
Yeah, she got promoted to the London Assembly, and
A lovely job.
Siân sort of stepped down within 3 days of being elected. I mean, just what do you guys think of that?
I mean, it's bizarre. I mean, I just couldn't imagine back in the day had like when it was me and Jenny Jones had we stood for election and then stepped down. I mean, it's just utterly bizarre behaviour. I think it's cynical behaviour, and I think it's it's the sort of thing that makes people really cynical about politics. And yes, you can play all sorts of semantics about, well, it was a list, and it's perfectly legal under the system, but that list of candidates was presented to the electors to then stand down just a few days later. It does seem very, very cynical, and I couldn't imagine that sort of trick being pulled in my day, and I think we would have been crucified by the party. Quite rightly, we would have been crucified by the party over it. But I think now the way things are so culturally entrenched, if someone is on your side, you'll put up with any old shite from them as long as they're on your side. On sort of these sort of controversial so-called culture war questions. If someone's on your side, it doesn't matter what old shit they come up with, support them.
It's
the only reason you would have done that, I'm interested to know whether it actually made any difference. But Siân's calculation must be, I'm going to live in Brighton, hopefully, and so there's no way I can be on the London Assembly. I've already stood down in Camden. So obviously I can't be on the London Assembly. I'm going to pretend to be, because my name recognition is better than Zoe's. Therefore, it's better to have me at the top of the list. Must have been the calculation. Whether or not that's true, I don't know whether any voters voting for the list actually think like that. But I thought what was interesting is that there was not a great deal of comeback, because it's the eternal relationship between Twitter and the real world, that did her vote share go down because she brought the party into disrepute on Twitter, or were there other factors? I noticed that at the hustings, which aren't the real world either, but Zoe Garbett was apparently doing extremely well. So Ross Lydall, the local government correspondent of the Evening Standard, said she was the breakout star of the election, which obviously the party communications people made a big thing of. It's a nice thing to say about you if you're standing for election. So the London journalists seem to be eating out of Zoe's palm. And nobody wanted to make a fuss about this shifty, cynical, really, really dodgy behaviour, and may not have done anybody any harm. However, I would be, I'm fascinated to see how it goes on the 4th of July in Brighton, if there is traction there, where I assume that the Green vote will be a lot more fluid now, that was very loyal to Caroline Lucas. I suspect it's much less likely to be loyal to somebody who was on the London Assembly for 3 days and then resigned.
So look, with 20 minutes to go, I'm just scanning a little bit of the chat and thinking, and want to bring in a couple of the comments here. Somebody said that Caroline Lucas has gone along with a lot of this. Prior to 2018, she was against sex workers' work, and it almost seemed like she changed overnight. Was it a deliberate abandoning of principles to get votes, or did she do the right thing in promoting party policy rather than her own opinions? So, where does this lie? What do you guys think? I'd love to hear a little bit more about your particular experience of Caroline and of Caroline Russell and of Siân, and what they actually believed when you worked with them compared to what we see them saying now.
I've known Caroline obviously a very long time, and I remember when we were on a train on the way to conference, when the Rupert Reed thing that I had blown up the previous month. This was back in 2015, and she was very, very sympathetic to Rupert, and was actually joking about the idea that people could genuinely believe that biological sex was not innate, but somehow liking dresses and glitter and pink was biologically innate, but being female and having ovaries was not. And she, we were actually joking about the ludicrousness of this on the train. So that tells you, that is telling about where she's coming from originally. But it's even more telling, not just what she said on a train, but if you look back to the article she wrote for The Guardian when the Amy Challoner thing and the dreadful David Challoner business all blew up in the press. One of the lines that she wrote in that article in August 2018 on gender issues, does say, in black and white, where she was coming from. I, like many others, have faced my own journey when it comes to understanding a new way of thinking about gender, one that's resulted in understanding how the idea of gender that's underpinned my lifelong feminism is very different to what it means and how it feels to be a trans person. She says in black and white that she's had to completely reverse her previous long-held principles on feminism in order to embrace this trendy new version. And
Darren, I think a lot of people within the party, I'm getting comments here that saying they don't actually think that Caroline wrote that it was written for her, that it was a way of her hedging her views and creating a shift. But
I mean, basically, there's three strands of people in the party who have allowed this to take hold. There's been the true believers who are so wrapped up in postmodernist delusion that they genuinely believe that trans women are female, and genuinely is just so wrapped up in delusion that they genuinely believe that. So there's the true believers. There's the people who pretend to believe it, and I put Caroline in this category, and that is very, what was either drafted for her or she wrote is very telling about where she was coming from. There's people who pretend to believe it because they feel that's the way the wind blows and that's the way things are going if you want a career in green politics, and that's the way that progressive politics is going, so we just have to pretend to believe it and not think about it too deeply. And then the third strand, which I mentioned earlier, is the people who have genuinely generally just kept their heads down and hope it goes away and kept quiet about it. Those three strands created a majority in the party that has allowed all this dangerous madness, which, we are talking policies that, have allowed for child abuse, as Simon was saying, as the Cass report makes very, very clear. So, those three strands of people have created a majority in the party for all this insane anti-science bullshit to take hold.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, history tells us a lot about, not saying things when it's the right time to say things, not doing the right thing. Simon, I do want to bring Jude in a minute to talk about the future of the party. And of course, we can't leave the evening without talking about the general election, which we know now is very clearly on the horizon. But have you got anything else to tell us about your experience of working with some of those people on the London Assembly before we, and what their opinions to have been and how versus how they're represented now before we move on?
Well, I can tell you a bit of gossip that Siân did not say it to me, so I cannot 100% swear that this is it is hearsay. But somebody told me that Siân had said to him, rolling her eyes about the Young Greens, to be honest, I'm a bit too second wave for all this, which is code for this is all a load of bullshit. And I mean, I think Darren makes a good. The person in the chat room who says Caroline Nicholas probably didn't write that article may well have a point. Caroline Nicholas is very busy, and she does have people who write articles for her. However, I think Darren is right that to highlight it that there are many people who have been on a journey of re-educating themselves because this is what their kids believe, and they have tried hard to listen. And like David Tennant with a non-binary kid and what have you, and we may find it preposterous. We may find it, really, really infuriating. But there is a degree of sincerity. They have convinced themselves because they have listened to their kids and they've validated what their kids are saying above all else, or above all logic. And so it is entirely possible that Siân has been on that journey too. But I would just balance it. Repeat that Siân was. That there was no in when I was around, that there was no nerdier person, and I mean this entirely in a complimentary way, than Siân Berry, because she loved getting her hands dirty. She didn't need a researcher because she was the best researcher there was, who really, really loved evidence-based policymaking. And how do you get from there to where she is now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. How indeed have we all become so open-minded, as the meme goes, that our brains have fallen out? I don't know. Anyway, Jude, let's talk about the future of the party and bringing these two gents again, because we've got a general election on the horizon. We've seen what's happened with the Scottish Greens very recently. Not in no small part because of the position that they chose to take on CAS, and generally with regards to self-ID as well. The SNP, it seems, wanted to distance themselves from the increasingly lunatic shenanigans of the Scottish Green Party, who have incidentally just expelled a whole load of their members who signed their version of the Scottish Green Women's Declaration. We're in contact with them and they've got our support and our solidarity and our sympathy. But Jude, what do you see as the future of the party going forward? We've got various different failures. Authoritarianism is rife. There's no accountability to our members. Safeguarding is an issue. What do you want to talk to us about?
It's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, obviously I've been a kind of, politician for the last 8 years before SAP, but I'm also very interested in systems and in organizations, and I've been looking at the Green Party for a long time thinking, what's going on. Now we can see that if we're going to grow, let's hope we do well at these next elections, because most people don't always notice this side of the Green Party. They just really still believe it's a fundamentally ecological party, and they believe all that kind of stuff that we all believe about the planet and all the rest of it. But we haven't invested in our governance. We've invested in this machine for winning elections. We don't understand that we're not just winning votes and winning numbers on a sheet. We're qualitatively putting public servants like myself into public service. It's a public servant role, not a waving a flag for the Green Party role. We're not training people. We're not in any way over the law here. I had a word with Siân outside the conference, the last conference in Brighton, and I asked her about Alison Teal and said, there will be many more court cases. Little did I know I was talking about myself then. But she said there is no price too high that the party will not pay in order to uphold our values on this issue. There is no price too high. Now, the Open University have just spent £1 million defending the indefensible with Joe Phoenix, case against a lesbian, Social Work England and Westminster have probably spent £500,000 defending the indefensible. And it looks like the Green Party wants to spend more money defending, this principle. And I just think unless somebody at the top of the tree gets a grip on this, we'll be, winning with one hand at the hearts and minds of the people around the country, and then leaking money and goodwill out the other side. And of course, if we want to be a pluralistic Liberal Party, which I think we are, we have to attract voters from the Liberals, from the Conservatives, from Labour, and from all other places. We've got an influx of Muslim voters who've come to us from Labour, as Simon said. But that in itself brings a very real culture clash within the party. And when people talk about a culture war, I think we need to start talking about a science war, because it's evidence-based science we're talking about, not culture. So I think we've got some really, really big problems to deal with once we kind of try to grow up and move into the next decade or two. If we have 10 MPs, are we going to not whip them? in which case we'll have people like maybe Adrian or other people who don't actually agree with this stuff and who will want to say what they think. So we know that there are people who are hiding their opinions in the party for all sorts of reasons to protect themselves. I think it's a huge problem. And of course, if you also expel your best and your brightest thinkers, and I think I would include most of the people in this Zoom call, you know, if you get rid of anyone who's got any kind of good ideas about how to change things, never mind this issue, you know, your intellectual core, and you just let the playpen run the place, we won't last very long. We will lose our credibility and we'll lose our money. There'll be a massive crisis and things will not go well. So it's a kind of warning, isn't it, that we can see it coming, and that we wish that the people would listen.
Yeah. I mean, I think as an ex-Labour Party member, historically, I would say that whatever games and shenanigans are being played within the party at the moment, if we are leaving ourselves open to being infiltrated by militant people from the hard left and people that are leaving Labour and joining us, you know, they will eat us for breakfast. The politicians and the political games that are being played at the moment are playground politics by comparison to some of the things that I've seen happen in the Labour Party. So there's another warning that's coming, you know, over the barricades, shall we say. There's another prong of attack. One of our members has messaged to say that she thinks it's important for men to get more involved in this discussion, in this debate. And I want to kind of thank both of you, Simon and Darren, for coming here and speaking to us this evening. We are the Green Women's Declaration. We are about women's issues, but we really were grateful to hear from you and your perspective. I wonder if you have thoughts when we're thinking about the future of the Green Party. There does seem, you know, we don't have a Green Men's Declaration. We have male signatories of the Green Women's Declaration, and thank you to them for signing the declaration. But what do you see that where's this? There's a gap that needs to be filled. How can it be filled? And what do you think we can do to enable men to fill that gap more than they are doing at the moment?
Well, I mean, in terms of the Scottish Green Party, I think that is absolutely unreformable. And, you know, I think it poses a danger. I think it's, you know, I would just like to see the party destroyed electorally and completely wiped out and completely disappear as a force in Scottish politics, because it is so beyond the pale. It is completely unreformable. Anyone who's any opposing view on this has just been completely frozen out or expelled. So I think the Scottish Green Party is completely unreformable, and I would like to see it destroyed and annihilated electorally. As for the Green Party of England and Wales, I do have some hope. I think it's, you know, it's touch and go whether things do turn round. But I do have some hope, and I think, you know, being a larger party, sort of numerically and geographically, I think it's been harder to exercise, you know, although they've tried bloody hard, I think it's harder to exercise the sort of complete thought control that they have in Scotland. So there's lots of, you know, there's lots of resistance, there's lots of people thinking differently and saying stuff in spite of all the disciplinary action. So I do have some hope still for the Green Party of England and Wales. I have decided in future I'm not going to vote for any Green candidate that I think is barking mad. So I will be asking them questions in future as to whether they get my vote or not. But I do have some hope still for the Green Party of England and Wales, but I have zero hope for the Scottish Green Party, and I hope it dies. A new force needs to come along, because that is not it. It just needs to end.
Thanks, Darren. Hearing that. Simon?
Well, if there's any journalists watching, you've got a soundbite now. Darren Johnson wants the Scottish Greens annihilated. It was worth staying for this long.
I can't be disciplined for that, because they've disaffiliated them from us.
Exactly. But I was
about Scottish Greens.
I was going to say that you know, there's a long list of people who've been expelled by Scottish Greens. If we're talking about looking on the bright side, the Green Party of England and Wales has been expelled by the Scottish Greens. So that shows that you know, there is something to hold on to. I think also, I said earlier, I have a similar relationship with people fighting away inside the Lib Dems, as I think some of you do as well. And they are starting from a much, much lower level than you are. They have had a brutal time. They are the little nucleus of people who are fighting against this are very, very isolated indeed. What they've got that you haven't got is they've got lots of peers in the House of Lords who give them resources and who aren't facing election and can keep their heads down. And there's quite a lot of Lib Dem peers now, I think. So they have got friendly people for them. But you've got Shara. We hadn't repraised Shara enough here, but Shara has been through an appalling time and has shown incredible courage and tenacity, and it had a great result. And Shara was for a reasonable time your deputy leader, wasn't he? So I think there is a lot to hold on to. The fight back within the Green Party is bigger than the fight back within, proportionately. Also, I think it's probably bigger than the fight back within the Labour Party, isn't it? In terms of the seniority of the people who are speaking out. So I think those are positive notes to end on. And then just on this question of men, I think Darren and I can both testify that being a gender critical man is actually, it's quite gratifying, particularly if there's an awful lot of gender critical men. No, there aren't a lot of gender critical men anyway. But to be a non-anonymous gender critical man, we're quite rare, and we get a lot of plaudits for it. It's quite flattering. People tell us that they're pleased with us and they're nice to us, and by and large, the experience in the comeback I've had from people who used to be my friends in the gay world, in the gay bubble, has not been particularly nice, and I tend to avoid it. And I now live in a very different environment. I live in the country, so I'm out of that world, so it doesn't really matter to me very much. But what we do not get, I mean, sometimes I tell women, I think possibly I've had one sort of vaguely violent threat through, I have a website that's got a contact form on it, so anybody can send anything anytime they like. And I've maybe had 3-4 bits of abuse on it in 5 years. And, women are just gobsmacked by that because they'd have got that in half an hour. So, the message to men is, of course, you need to be quite committed to it because you need to listen to women a lot and to understand what the issues are, whereas it comes much more naturally to women who you are grounded in this, and we have to sort of run to catch up a little bit. But it is, it is a lot safer for us than it is for women. So coming in, the water's fine.
I've had one threatening tweet and one threatening email in however many years I've been speaking out on this. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you so much. We do have to wrap up now. There's been loads more questions in the chat that we haven't had a chance to address, but I hope we've covered a lot of ground this evening. It's been quite a roller coaster ride, really. Jude, is there anything else you want to add before we close? And then I'll just...
Nothing, apart from I noticed that Shara is in the room, and I would just like to publicly express our gratitude to him for the court case. And of course, that's only the beginning. We're waiting, or he's waiting on a remedies amount soon. So we must try to now work on that fantastically brave and excellent work that's happened there. And I think, Simon, you're right that we've got, we have got a kind of... Shara said to me once when I was feeling quite despairing about all this, that, if we can turn the Greens around on this issue, it's exactly the same, because it's so fanatical and so obsessed. And it's the opposite of that thing we said earlier about leading. If we can lead people back, that's why this is such an important fight and why we're still in it. And so I'd just like to kind of reflect back on that and just publicly thank Shara for that as well, because in a way, he's been, the only... a really, really important leader in the party. I mean, we know that Jenny's kind of trying behind the scenes, but not really. So it's been quite difficult, hasn't it? where we get our resources from is the next big thing. And I think that's something that perhaps we need to think more carefully about, resources. So you kind of think about that. But thanks to you two for coming, and thanks for everybody for watching, and let's see where this leads. Hopefully not to more suspensions.
If there is anybody that can pop the link for the Green Women's Declaration website in the chat, that would be really, really helpful. I do want to say thanks so much to both Darren and Simon. And if anybody as well wants to kind of think a little bit more around the subject, particularly, how it relates, how gender ideology is impacting all of us, you can of course look to Simon's books. The End of the World is Flat, and In the Beginning, they're both thinly disguised satires on gender ideology. So you can explore those as well. And of course, Simon, you've also been involved in publishing the Graham Linehan's book as well. So, well done on getting that out there, because I think that's another really important piece of writing. It's called Tough Crowd. Thanks everybody for coming.
Darren's got books too, Zoe.
Darren, do you want to tell us about your books?
My 3 books were on 70s glam rock, the Slade Suite and Suzi Quattro. And actually, although the men dressed in very feminine costumes, after many months and years of research, I found out that they're not actually women, they're men. And even though Suzi Quattro wore a black leather jumpsuit, she was still female underneath. So who knew?
It's totally on point, actually. I was thinking it wasn't quite as on point with our theme, but it totally is. Thank you for pointing that out, Darren. All right, listen, we do have to thank you so much to everybody here. I would like to say thank you to all of you guys for being here. Jude is sort of talking about how do we resource ourselves. One of the ways that we are resourced, one of the ways that we continue to stay and to resist this insidious ideology is because of support from people like you. And I would like to name check all of the women who are in the team within the Green Women's Declaration. It's a true sisterhood. It's a masterclass in feminist power sharing and making sure that things continue. We weave together in ways which have just I'm just going to say touched my heart, because that's how the words are landing within me. I am a Green after all, and I'm going to always have those hippie vibes within me as well. Let's say thank you once again. Thank you so much to everybody, and good night, and enjoy the unfolding election process. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having
Yeah,
us.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.